In just 44 seconds, one of Britain's most beloved morning show hosts managed to ignite a firestorm that sent Hollywood legend Pierce Brosnan storming off set in absolute fury. What started as a friendly chat about his latest film project descended into a vicious personal attack that left the former James Bond actor visibly shaking with anger, the studio audience gasping in shock, and producers scrambling to salvage what became the most explosive morning television meltdown in recent memory. Before we dive into exactly what went down, make sure you subscribe to this channel for daily videos exposing Britain's darkest scandals. We bring you the confrontations, the controversies, and the chaos that the mainstream media tries to sweep under the rug. The atmosphere in the studio last night seemed pleasant enough at first. Pierce Brosnan walked onto the Lorraine set with his trademark charm, waving to the audience who erupted in applause. He looked relaxed in a tailored navy suit, that famous smile lighting up his face as he settled into the guest chair opposite Lorraine Kelly. The Scottish presenter welcomed him warmly, gushing about how wonderful it was to have him on the show. Brosnan thanked her graciously, commenting on how he'd always enjoyed her program over the years. Lorraine started with the expected softball questions. She asked about his new thriller that's set to premiere next month, and Brosnan spoke passionately about the project, describing the intense preparation he'd undertaken for the role. He talked about working with the director, about shooting on location in Ireland, and about how much he'd enjoyed returning to his roots. Lorraine nodded along, smiling that familiar smile viewers know so well. Everything seemed perfectly normal, perfectly pleasant, perfectly safe. Then she shifted gears. Her smile stayed fixed in place, but there was something different in her tone as she said, "Now, Pierce, I have to ask you about something that's been making headlines." Brosnan's expression remained open, curious. He had no idea what was coming. "There's been quite a bit of talk about your wife, Keely," Lorraine continued, and immediately the energy in the room changed. You could see Brosnan's jaw tighten just slightly, his posture becoming more guarded. "People have been commenting online about her appearance at your recent film premiere," Lorraine pressed on, her voice taking on an edge that felt almost cruel. "There's been some discussion about her weight gain over the years. How do you respond to those who say you could have done better, that you deserve someone who takes better care of themselves?" The studio audience went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Brosnan stared at Lorraine with an expression of pure disbelief, his face flushing red. For a moment, he seemed unable to speak, as if he couldn't quite believe what he just heard. When he finally found his voice, it was low and controlled, but absolutely seething with barely contained rage. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" he asked, each word deliberate and measured. Lorraine didn't back down. If anything, she leaned in further, clearly thinking she was onto something. "Oh, come on, Pierce. You know what I'm talking about. The internet has been full of comments. Some people are saying she's let herself go. As someone in the public eye, surely you understand that appearances matter. Don't you think she has a responsibility to look a certain way, especially when she's on your arm at these high-profile events?" Brosnan's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. His knuckles had gone white. "A responsibility?" he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Are you actually asking me this question? Are you seriously sitting there, on national television, body-shaming my wife?" Lorraine waved her hand dismissively. That infuriating smile still plastered on her face. "I'm not body-shaming anyone, Pierce. I'm simply asking about the public discourse. Surely you've seen the comments. Surely you have thoughts about it. I mean, you're James Bond. You could have any woman in the world. Don't you ever wish she'd make more of an effort?" The audience gasped. Several people in the front row looked genuinely appalled. One woman covered her mouth with her hand. But Lorraine seemed oblivious to the reaction she was getting, or perhaps she simply didn't care. She was chasing what she clearly thought was compelling television, and she wasn't about to stop now. Brosnan leaned forward in his chair, his eyes blazing. "Let me tell you something about my wife," he said, his voice rising now, the Irish accent becoming more pronounced with his anger. "Keely is the most beautiful woman I have ever known. She is kind, she is intelligent, she is talented, and she is the love of my life. The fact that you would sit there and suggest that her worth is somehow tied to her dress size or her weight is absolutely disgusting." Lorraine tried to interrupt, holding up her hand. "Pierce, I think you're being a bit sensitive. Sensitive? Brosnan cut her off, his voice now loud enough to echo through the studio. You just insulted my wife on live television and you're telling me I'm being sensitive? What the hell is wrong with you? The producer could be heard off camera, speaking urgently into someone's earpiece. But Lorraine pushed forward, seemingly determined to defend her line of questioning. I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking, Pierce. We live in a society where image matters. You're a movie star. You're expected to maintain a certain standard, and surely your spouse should too. It's not unreasonable to. Stop talking, Brosnan said flatly, cutting her off mid-sentence. Just stop bloody talking. You don't get to tell me what's reasonable when it comes to my marriage. You don't get to sit there in judgment of a woman you don't know, who has done nothing to you, who is worth 100 of you. Lorraine's smile finally faltered. She seemed to realize that this wasn't going the way she'd planned. Now hold on just a minute. No, you hold on, Brosnan shot back. I've been in this industry for over 40 years. I've done hundreds of interviews. I've been asked all sorts of questions, some appropriate, some not so much. But I have never in all my years been subjected to such a disgusting, shallow, mean-spirited line of questioning. You should be ashamed of yourself. The tension in the studio was unbearable. Camera operators didn't know where to point their cameras. The audience sat frozen, watching this disaster unfold in real time. Lorraine, finally seeming to understand that she'd made a massive miscalculation, tried to salvage the situation. Pierce, I apologize if you found my questions offensive. That wasn't my intention. I was simply trying to have an honest conversation about the pressures of being in the public eye and— Your intention? Brosnan interrupted, shaking his head in disgust. Your intention was to humiliate my wife for cheap ratings. Your intention was to body shame a woman who has never done anything but support me, love me, and be there for me through everything. Your intention was to reduce a brilliant, accomplished woman down to nothing but her physical appearance. Well, congratulations, Lorraine. You've shown everyone exactly who you are. Lorraine's face had gone pale. She was clearly panicking now, realizing this interview had gone completely off the rails. I really don't think you're being fair, she said, her voice taking on a defensive tone. I was asking legitimate questions that many people have wondered about. If you and your wife put yourselves in the public eye, you open yourselves up to public scrutiny. That's just the reality of fame. That was apparently the final straw. Brosnan stood up abruptly, yanking off his microphone and tossing it onto the chair. Public scrutiny? He said, his voice dripping with contempt. Is that what you call this? This isn't journalism, Lorraine. This isn't even entertainment. This is just cruelty dressed up as conversation. He took a step toward where Lorraine sat, and she actually flinched slightly in her chair. But Brosnan wasn't threatening. He was simply making sure she heard every word he was about to say. My wife has been through things you couldn't even imagine, he said, his voice shaking now with emotion. She lost her first husband. She's raised children. She's supported me through the loss of my first wife. She's built a career as a journalist herself. She's done charity work around the world. She's one of the most compassionate, wonderful human beings I've ever met. And you think the most important thing about her is what size dress she wears? You think that's what matters? Lorraine opened her mouth to respond, but Brosnan held up his hand, silencing her. I don't want to hear it. I don't want your apology. I don't want your explanation. I don't want anything from you. What I want is for people to understand that this, right here, this attitude you've displayed, this obsession with women's bodies, this idea that a woman's worth is tied to her appearance, this needs to stop. It needs to end. And shame on you for perpetuating it. The audience burst into applause. Several people stood up, clapping loudly. One man shouted, "Good for you," from the back row. Lorraine looked around, clearly stunned by the response. She'd completely lost the room, and she knew it. Pierce, please, let's just take a breath and— she started, but Brosnan was already walking away from the guest area, heading toward the exit. Lorraine stood up from her chair, calling after him. Pierce, we still have 10 minutes left in the segment. We haven't talked about your film yet. Brosnan stopped and turned back to face her one last time. You want to talk about my film? Here's what you need to know. It's about a man who stands up to bullies. It's about someone who refuses to let others be torn down by small-minded, petty people who hide their own insecurities behind cruel comments and judgmental attitudes. I think you should watch it, Lorraine. You might learn something. With that, he turned and strode toward the studio exit. Producers rushed toward him, clearly trying to convince him to stay, to finish the interview, to smooth things over. But Brosnan brushed past them without a word, his expression set in stone. One producer grabbed his arm, and Brosnan gently but firmly removed the man's hand from his jacket. Back on set, Lorraine stood in the middle of her stage, looking shell-shocked. The audience had gone from applauding Brosnan to murmuring amongst themselves, clearly processing what they just witnessed. Lorraine tried to regain her composure, that professional mask slipping back into place, but it was too late. Everyone had seen her true colors. "Well," she said, forcing a laugh that sounded completely hollow, "that certainly took an unexpected turn. Pierce is clearly very passionate about his family, which is admirable, though I do think he perhaps overreacted to some fairly standard questions about life in the spotlight." The audience didn't buy it. Several people actually booed. A woman in the third row stood up and walked out. Lorraine's smile became more strained, more desperate. She was trying to maintain control of her show, but control was the last thing she had in that moment. "Let's take a quick break," she said, her voice tight. "When we come back, we'll have a cooking segment with—" But before she could finish, Brosnan's voice echoed from somewhere off stage, clearly picked up by a hot mic. "Absolutely disgraceful," he was saying to someone, presumably a member of the production staff. "I've never walked off a show in my life, but I will not sit there and let someone trash my wife like that. Not for anything." Lorraine heard it too. Everyone heard it. Her face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. She gestured frantically to someone off camera, probably telling them to cut the feed, to go to commercial, to do something, anything to salvage this disaster. But the damage was done. The cameras kept rolling for a few more seconds, capturing Lorraine's facade completely crumbling. She slumped back into her chair, running her hands through her hair, muttering something under her breath that the microphones couldn't quite pick up. Members of the production team rushed onto the set, surrounding her, their urgent whispers audible even over the audience's continued murmuring. The stage manager finally made the call to cut the cameras, but not before one final shot of the empty guest chair, the discarded microphone lying on the cushion where Pierce Brosnan had been sitting just minutes before. It was a powerful image, a symbol of an interview gone catastrophically wrong, of a host who had pushed too far and paid the price. From the back of the studio, near the exit, Brosnan could be heard one more time, his voice carrying clearly across the space. "Tell your boss she owes my wife an apology," he said to someone. "A public one, on air. And even then, I'm not sure it will be enough to make up for what she said today." The sound of a door slamming echoed through the studio, and then Pierce Brosnan was gone, leaving behind a stunned audience, a panicking production crew, and a host who had just learned a very public, very harsh lesson about the consequences of crossing the line. Lorraine stood in the center of her ruined set, surrounded by her team, the weight of what had just happened clearly sinking in. She'd come into this interview expecting to create a buzzworthy moment, to generate headlines, to boost her ratings. She'd succeeded in all those goals, but not in the way she'd intended. Instead of being remembered as the host who got Pierce Brosnan to open up about his life, she'd be remembered as the woman who attacked his wife and drove him from the stage. The audience began to file out, their excited chatter filling the studio. Some were already pulling out their phones, no doubt rushing to social media to share what they'd just witnessed. Within minutes, the story would be everywhere. The video clips would go viral. The think pieces would start appearing. And at the center of it all would be Lorraine Kelly, the host who had spectacularly misjudged her guest and paid the ultimate professional price. One of the producers approached Lorraine, speaking urgently in her ear. She shook her head, clearly arguing with him, gesturing toward the empty guest chair. But whatever she was saying, whatever excuse or justification she was trying to offer, it didn't matter. The show was over. The damage was irreversible. And somewhere outside the studio, Pierce Brosnan was probably calling his wife, telling her what had happened, assuring her that he'd defended her, that he'd stood up for her, that he'd walked away rather than allow someone to disrespect the woman he loved. The lights in the studio began to dim as the crew started breaking down the set. Lorraine finally moved from her spot, walking slowly toward her dressing room. Her shoulders slumped. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated. She'd come into work that morning as a respected television presenter with a long and successful career. She was leaving as the woman who had insulted Pierce Brosnan's wife and sparked one of the most dramatic walkouts in morning television history. The assistant director was already on the phone, probably with network executives, probably trying to explain how a simple celebrity interview had turned into a public relations nightmare. The camera operators were reviewing the footage, no doubt already imagining how it would look when it inevitably leaked online. The audience members were still talking among themselves in the lobby, recounting what they'd seen, comparing their impressions, their phones held high as they recorded videos explaining to their followers that they'd just witnessed television history. And through it all, one truth remained crystal clear. Pierce Brosnan had entered that studio expecting a professional interview about his work, his craft, his latest project. Instead, he'd been ambushed with personal attacks against his wife, disguised as legitimate questions about life in the public eye. And unlike many celebrities who might have smiled through the discomfort, who might have given a diplomatic non-answer and moved on, Brosnan had stood his ground. He'd defended his wife with passion and conviction. He'd called out the cruelty for what it was. And he'd walked away with his dignity intact, leaving Lorraine Kelly to face the consequences of her choices alone. The empty studio now stood as a monument to what happens when journalists forget that their subjects are human beings, with feelings, with loved ones, with lines that should never be crossed. Lorraine had crossed that line, sprinted right over it really, and Brosnan had shown her exactly what that meant. In those final moments before the studio went completely dark, one thing was abundantly clear. This was a confrontation that would be talked about for years to come, a cautionary tale about respect, boundaries, and the price of going too far in the pursuit of ratings. Pierce Brosnan had walked onto that stage as a guest. He'd walked off as a defender, a husband, and a man who refused to let anyone diminish the woman he loved, no matter how famous the platform or how bright the lights.